Who's happy to be here this morning? Ooh, it doesn't sound like it. I guess this is a little bit different. It's the first time. It's official, right? I had several folks give me congratulations, had a few people give me condolences, and some people say we'll see. But I believe everything happens for a reason, and I'm very excited about the journey that we're on together as we move forward here over the next few months and the coming year. So this morning, we're going to talk about not a parable. I like parables, I like stories, but we're going to talk about a miracle this morning that Jesus performed. It's one of the few miracles that Jesus performed that is in all four Gospels. And it's interesting that when you go through and you look, it's in Matthew chapter 14, Mark chapter 6, Luke chapter 9, and John chapter 6. And we're talking about when Jesus fed the 5,000. And then there's another account when he fed the 4,000 that goes with it. Now, just some things to think about here. Now, we know that that's 5,000 men, because ladies and kids don't count, at least at this point in time in the hierarchy of things. And we'll wrap up with, I'll just tell you the end and the beginning, is there's 7 takeaways that we have for us as a congregation from this story. And so Matt, I was looking to see, Matt's got the scripture. If you want to turn, well, actually, before we get to that, let's lay a little foundation of what's going on here. Earlier in chapter 14, we hear about and we're given the account of the execution and the beheading of John the Baptist. John the Baptist, we know, was a precursor for Christ. Some would say that Jesus was actually a disciple of John the Baptist, that there was some time spent together in study and prayer. They were related to go through that. And John the Baptist did something that all spiritual leaders should never do. He poked the king. He criticized King Herod. He criticized some of the things that he did, some of his relationships, and that got in there, and wives and second wives, and I think somewhere in there, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think that maybe he took a wife that maybe had been his brother's, and his brothers had. It gets dramatic and typical old times things. A lot of questionable things. Those in power doing things that probably aren't morally correct, and John the Baptist kind of called him out on it, and he ended up in prison. And they were having a banquet, and then King Herod, the daughter of a woman, I think was kind of his mistress, I'm not sure, performs the dance. She oohs and ahs everybody, and he gives an oath that whatever you want I shall give you because you have pleased me so well, which is creepy on all kinds of levels. And she says she wants John the Baptist's head on a plate. King Herod had wanted to execute John the Baptist for the thorn in his side that he had become, but he was afraid of the people and his followers and what they would do. So he hadn't done it. And so the dance takes place. He makes the promise. The girl, at the urging of her mother, who had it in for John the Baptist, also says, tells her what to ask for. King Herod is publicly obligated to fulfill her wish because of what he had promised and the oath that he had taken. And so we're sitting here, and this is where we are. And so in chapter 14, where I'm going to pick up with Jesus feeds the 5,000, it's verse 13. It says, "When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place." Leads me to think that Jesus was very distraught by what had happened. He needed to reflect, to grieve, and to kind of work on this. Hearing of this, hearing that Jesus was going to a private place, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So the disciples and Jesus up to this point had been working. They had been dealing with the crowd. They had been doing healing and miracles. If you go to the other 3 accounts, all of the disciples are reporting back to Jesus what they had been doing. The healing, the spiritual counseling, the ministry that they had been. Then they get the news about John the Baptist. Then they go to the quiet place to kind of reflect and be able to do that. Pick up with verse 15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the village and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples replied, "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." They answered. Jesus says, "Bring them to me." And he directed the people to sit down. Varies from groups of 150 to groups of 50, depending on which account you read, which I guess that works out in math-wise because 150 is a multiple of 50, so that just depends on how they decided to look at it. To sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the bread. And he gave them up to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate were 5,000 men, besides the women and children. Let's go to prayer. Father God, as we gather here today, I just ask that you bless the reading of your word, that you let those words burn into our heart. And as we contemplate what you wanted to teach us from this, that we receive clarification, that we receive the message that you'd have us to receive, and that you be with us as we then take that message and try to apply it to our lives. In your Son's holy name, amen. So let's set the scene here. 5,000 people found Jesus when he went off to be alone. They were following him because of what he had done for them thus far. There had been all kinds of miracles, healings. He was healing the sick, making the blind see, making the mutes talk. I mean, big time stuff. And he was starting to get a reputation out there. People wanted to see what was next. That's why they started following him. They weren't following him because they had a passion or a need for the good news. They were following him to see what's next. And so they go out. They go out in the boat, and this, shortly after this story, we get into the Sea of Galilee. We get Peter walking on the water. I mean, that's the next thing that comes up. And so, as we're sitting there, we get there, and the first thing that I have in my notes that's important to notice is that they've gone off to the quiet place. They're in the boat, but the people are following on land. Depending on which account you read, some of them says they were running after them because they wanted to see what was next. Because obviously it's probably not the lame that are running after them. Maybe it's the ones that have already been healed and they're excited about it. But it says, the first thing it says, Jesus had compassion on the crowd. That's the first takeaway that we have, is that he had compassion on the crowd. He saw the need. He recognized the need, and he had compassion on it. And so they started healing the sick again. And it leads you to believe from a chronological standpoint that they found out about John the Baptist. It must have been midday. So they go on and they start, and so it's after lunch and they're going. And then it says the evening's approaching. Now in this time, they're about a month before Passover. So it's about right now in the time of the spring season there. You have temperatures in the 60s and 70s, lows in the 40s at night. It's pretty pleasant. People were there to do it. But the disciples come in there, they say, the evening's almost here. We need to send these people home. Doesn't say where they're from. We don't know how far a trip it is. And depending on which account you read, there's some of them that says, well, hey, you go and, let's send them to go find lodging and find bread, find food. We don't want that responsibility, so go do it. But what's Jesus say? Jesus says, no. He says, you give them something to eat. That's kind of monumental, and I think that's where we find ourselves a lot of times. How many times have you known something needs to be done, but we wait for somebody else to do it? All of the disciples at this point in time, they're sitting on their hands in their pockets, and Philip was the only one that said anything. It said the rest of them just kind of stayed quiet. And then they get the excuses. Well, they say, well, what are we going to feed them? And they say, well, send them to go get bread. Or then Jesus says, you feed them. And then immediately, now you all know, if you think about, let's think about the people that we know. You know people that work out this way. The first thing, there's the objection that come in the other accounts is one of them says, well, that's a half a year's wages. Where are we going to get that? First concern was money. They go, how are we going to do it? Why are we going to do it? Well, it's not our job to feed them. Now, we only know what was said in the account, but could you imagine, this is the edited version. What else would go on? You know, what would happen if we were having a car show here and 5,000 people showed up and it says, okay, we got to feed them. Imagine the discussion. How are we going to do that? Why we got to do that? How are we going to pay for it? What did they do to deserve us to be like that? Now, also, let's look at it from a standpoint, too, about a meal. As you can tell, meals are important to me. But a meal is a level of intimacy amongst people. Sometimes you have meals with strangers. It's awkward, but small talk and things like that. But then also sometimes a meal can be between good friends, and it's a time of renewal. It's a time of learning. It's a time of celebration. It can be a time of grieving and mourning. I mean, there's a lot of things that can go with a meal. But I'm going to tell you, one of my love languages is for me to cook you food, provide you a meal. That's a level of intimacy that I think that there's one of the things that Jesus is a takeaway that he wanted us to have here in this is to understand that he had compassion on them. He understood where they were. He understood what the situation was. He also, he knew what he was going to do because nobody starts a plan nobody just does stuff without a plan. He knew what he was going to do, and there was some testing going on. He wanted to see what his disciples would respond. What's my team going to do? Think about this. It's a pop quiz. Do they know who he is? Do they really know? And so they kick the can around a little bit and they discuss it, and I can imagine how heated it was. Because I kind of get the idea that Jesus was obviously the leader, but I think there was more peer-to-peer there than it was just like a staunch hierarchy. And he's playing and the game's kind of being played that he doesn't want to tip his hand to who he is yet, because we're a year from the crucifixion at this point in time. Because we know that the crucifixion takes place at Passover, so we're a year. So he's just getting things going. I mean, obviously he's got something going because 5,000 people showed up in the middle of nowhere, walked around a lake to come see what he was going to do next. He knows the people are tired. He knows they're hungry. He knows it's been a long day because the evening is almost here. So how many of you, now I guess it wouldn't be that big of a deal for them, but how many of you would be tired after spending all day outside? Kind of goes in there with it. So the first test is he knows that he asked the disciples what they're going to do, but they don't know who they're working with. And do they really know what Jesus can do? Next thing they do is they take inventory. Well, okay, so we can't go buy bread. We can't send them away, so we're going to have to do something. And they do inventory. What do we have? They basically have 5 muffins and 2 dried fish. Dried, smoked, or salted. You pick what the variety is. Use your imagination there, but that's how they did that. But think about the objections. How are we going to do this? We're so far away. Think about the doubt. We have 5,000 people here that's hangry, and we're going to approach them with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and we're going to solve this problem. That was one boy's lunch. I think it's emphasis that they say it was a boy, because that's a boy's lunch, not a man's lunch. But we see that in the hands of the Father, in the hands of Jesus, we see the miracle take place. He gives thanks. But still, think about it. This miracle is as much for the disciples. I think it's actually more for the disciples than it was for the crowd. Because later on, you can find out that he sends the crowd off the next day. He kind of sends them off, and they show up and want to know what he's going to feed them next, and they're like, well, Moses got manna. What are you going to give us next? And then he kind of gets mad and he sends them off, and they go about their way. But think about what he's the disciples. He's helping them understand who he is, what he can do, and he puts the emphasis on a few things: obedience, service, and he puts the focus on the mindset of doing what you're called to do. And so, getting into my takeaways here, the wrap up here, as we look at this, not the wrap up, but just kind of summarizing things here. The first thing, it says that Jesus had compassion on the people because he knew who they were, he knew what they needed, and he also knew the lesson he needed to teach his disciples. But that all starts with compassion. How many times, and my mama used to say this to me, she says, to know to do good and not do it is bad. And in her mind, that was the same as doing bad. So how many times are we touched each day that we're out and about because we know the world's hurting, we know that people need us because, we think, oh, well, God's got this, but we forget that we have a role in that maybe God's got this because of what David's going to do, or because of what Sue's going to do, or what Britt's going to do. But we lack compassion, so we miss opportunity. So that compassion is super important when it comes to recognizing needs and us being able to meet them. So as a congregation, what do we need to be more compassionate about? What opportunities are we missing to minister and to serve? Right here in our community, maybe even right here in our congregation. Those are things that we have to process, we have to think about. And they can be tough. That's a tough conversation to have, to think that maybe we missed something. Be obedient when God calls you to work or serve. How many of you have ever ignored a call? You've ignored it. Or you excuse it to death. I'm too busy. I don't have the resources. Somebody else will do it. Those are all the same things that were going on with the disciples when Jesus said, feed them. Well, how can I do that? Why would I do that? That's not me. That's not what I'm comfortable for. And I'll tell you, for me, when David retired the first time, he set me up so good. It was so funny. He got me to go to St. Meinrad's out there to that retreat, and we rode together. And we had all kinds of stuff going on, and he tells me that he's about ready to retire, and he's got a plan. And I'm like, dude, that's scary. I don't think that's right. And then he says, well, I've got a plan. I think I know somebody that can take over the church and everything will go well. And I go, really? Who's that? And he goes, you. This was like 2019. It was pre-COVID. And I did exactly what the disciples did. I say that because this has been a process of getting here. So it wasn't something that just happened over. It wasn't like I woke up one day and said that. It's been working there. But I think that we know that obedience is the number one trait that we need for success. We've all ignored the call for things. We've all seen somebody in a bad situation, and we either we keep walking, we ignore it, we pretend like we don't see it, we don't have the compassion that we need to handle it. Has it ever happened to you? It has me. Third takeaway. Don't expect someone else to do what God has called you to do. Philip was told, he brought it up. I think it's in Luke, in the account in Luke, where Philip's the one that comes to him, and apparently the disciples have all kind of seen what was going on, and it's like he gets to be the spokesman. How did he draw the short straw for that? You got to go talk to the teacher and tell him that we got to do something. He's the one, and he gets the test. But the other disciples were just as guilty as he was of trying to kick the can down the road, not doing what needed to be done. And sometimes we as believers, as individuals and as a congregation, need to have the mindset of if it's meant to be, it's up to me. If it's to be done, me. Think of where we would be and how much better off we would be if more people said, if they saw the problem and they were ready to solve it, or ready to work on it, knowing they don't have the answers, but they're willing to take the first step. Takeaway 4. When you have had compassion, you see a need, you see the call, you understand, you hear you know what you're supposed to do, you realize that you're the one that's supposed to do it. And this is what I call the bargaining phase. This is when all the excuses and when all the doubt and all of the lack of faith and all of those things start piling on. Because you're at that point right now. At this point, you've got to make a decision. Am I going to do this or am I not? And there's a lot of people, and the disciples were in this point too. I bet that when they decided that they were ready to do it and they were going to be obedient, they were doubting. They had a lack of faith. But here's what you have to know, that if you are in good faith and you answer the call, you're compassionate, you see the call, you answer the call, and you take that first step, what you have is enough, at least to start. They did the inventory. What do we got? Now, it's a whole nother sermon to get into the sacrificial mindset of the boy who gave them the lunch. Think of the sacrifice he had to make. Now, he may have done it willingly because he's like, I want to see what's going to happen. But, I had been that kid that said, well, what about my lunch? But know what you have is enough and start the work. Because that's where the miracle comes in. You look at all these little parts. The compassion, answering the call, being obedient, being faithful, or having the faith that it's going to work out. And before they start the work, what happens? They give the resources to Jesus. They say, I don't know if this is going to work out. We know Thomas is back there saying, are you crazy? This isn't going to go. We know that. But they give what they've got to Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He gives thanks. He blesses what they have. They start. And then the magic happens. When we are thankful for what we have, and we turn it over to God, good things start happening. 6th takeaway. I thought 7 was appropriate. It's one for each day of the week. 6, get started. Recognize the call. Be compassionate. Recognize what you got to do. Be obedient. Know that you've got to do it. Know what you have is enough. Give thanks and get started. They started handing it out. They started feeding. Now, so if it's 5,000 men, that means there's got to be probably, not everybody's going to be lucky enough to be married, so let's just say, let's be conservative. Let's say that 60% of them were married, so that gives what? That's 3,000 women. And then if there's a good old average of Americans, and let's say there's 2.1 children, what are we looking at? 12,000 people from them athletes? 5 loaves, 2 fishes, 12,000 people. It wasn't compulsory school at that point in time, so the kids were with them. 5,000, 10,000, 12,000, 13,000, I don't know. But think of the faith that it took, the realization they had to stand there with that meager little thing they had, a boy's lunch, and to start handing it out. And then they say that at the end they gathered 12 baskets of scraps. I don't know if that's fish carcasses. I don't know if that's broken loaves. I'm not sure what that goes with. But they did. And the last takeaway here is you've got to have faith. You have faith in God's provision. If God's for us, who can be against us, right? If we're doing the work that we're called to do in the way that He has called us to do it, everything that we need to do it will be taken care of. The provision will be met. And the story will be accomplished. That's hard to think about sometimes. Because we live in a world today where we don't see miracles like that. You know, could you imagine what it would be like if that was on a Facebook Live and somebody live streamed it? Go crazy. Which I've always said, you know why we can't prove the existence of God? I've always said this, because if you can prove the existence of God, then it would take away free will, because then it means everything He said is true, and then people would follow Him, love Him, revere Him, not because of choice, but because of fear. But that's where the faith comes in, that we have to overcome our personal fear of failure and know that when we have been called, that we will be equipped, that we'll be provided for, that we will have provision, and that we will be able to do the work that's before us. So that's my takeaways for us for this week. I hope you found some value in that, because this is very important for our future as a congregation. I promise, for whatever that's worth, that if we're as compassionate as we can be and we find the needs and we go to work to meet those needs, that we will increase our influence and that we will be sustained. And it's okay if you have doubt. It's okay that you worry. It's okay that you don't understand how it's all going to work out. It's okay. Because ultimately, when it's all said and done, the most important part is that we're obedient and that we start. And that we understand that while we're doing God's work, we're ministering to people, we're serving people, we're outreaching, we're doing those things, that those efforts will be blessed. I mean, 12 baskets of scraps is pretty impressive. Of course, they didn't tell us how much they eat either. They didn't tell if they had a bunch of guys like me or some of the other ones there. But still, when I was a little kid, they told me, they said, "Once you think about something about the size of a muffin," that's what the loaf was. Then I always thought in my mind 2 bluegill being the dried fish that they had. I mean, I think about that and it just makes me go. But when we celebrate the obedience of the disciples, their faithfulness, and it's okay too, because I know they had doubt. Thomas was with them. We know that. But if we do what we're called, we answer the call, the provisions will be provided, and we'll have the influence that we need to have. Great song. As we wrap up this week, please stay for the refreshments that we have, and I want to give you a challenge. And the challenge is very simple: is what can you be more compassionate about? And what miracle do you need to do this week? What's the work that each one of us will have an opportunity this week, and we'll get to make a decision. Am I going to do what I need to do, or am I going to ignore it? Am I going to be the actor that God uses to solve this problem or help this person, or am I going to look the other way and expect someone else to do it? And I'll say is that you're going to have a big doubt of whether you should. You might even be angry about it, because it might be somebody that you don't want to have to do it for. There's a lot of things that could factor into that. But I want you to know that if you take the obedience and you take the step, that the provisions will be there and the work will be done. Because that's what we're called to do. Jesus, Lord, we thank you for the birds that are singing, the sun that's shining, and the fact that winter is quickly fading away. And we just ask that you be with us this week, that you keep us in your will, that you keep our eyes open, our hearts open, our ears listening for the opportunities to be the disciples that you've called us to be. To be your hands, to be your feet, to be the ones that are doing your work here for those who may not know you, for those who need to know you, or for those that just need to know you're real. Bless the food that we have here this morning. Bless the hands that prepared it. Keep us healthy, keep us safe, and keep us in your will. In your Son's holy name, amen.